What's up? This is Mark Pelkey here. I got a Roland TM-2 here. When you're first setting these things up, you're really sometimes overwhelmed with the different settings and parameters that you got to go through in order to get things dialed in. So I've already gone through and done that and made a detailed list of all the different settings and parameters that I use with my setup. So I'll show you real quick here. I got my module, right? And we've got our outputs over here and your trigger inputs over here. Now, these are dual zone trigger inputs. Therefore, you can have one single trigger to each port, which has the center as well as the edge, which can be programmed to produce unique sounds based on striking either of the two. But you can get a splitter here and be able to piggyback two single zone triggers to each port. So you could have a total number of 4 triggers, although you only have 2 trigger inputs. With that in mind, you have to make sure that you have a tip sleeve mono style 1/4" cable for the Y splitter type, whereas if you're using a dual zone trigger, meaning center and edge, then you need to ensure that you have the tip ring sleeve. So the tip is the center of the head, the ring is the edge, and then the sleeve is the ground. If you have a dual zone trigger and you're beating on the edge and you're not getting anything going on, it's most likely because you used a mono cable as opposed to a stereo style cable. So it's gonna jump in over here. I'm kind of ad-libbing here. I got some activity going on here at the house. Kids making noise and stuff on the TV, so just bear with me here as I deal with that. So let's switch it on over. Let's first take a quick peek at the manual. Start up here at the top. Now, before you begin and do anything, you should have a SD card, which goes here in the lower left corner of the front of the unit. There's an update that Roland released some time ago. I'm not exactly sure when, but it's version 1.0.2, I believe. So with that in mind, you go to the Roland website and just type in TM-2 and just navigate the website. You'll be able to find that update and follow those instructions in order to flash the unit out. From what I could see, when I did my firmware update, it retained all of the settings that were in the unit, although I would caution you to create a backup if you already have settings that currently work for you. Moving right along, back up whatever it is that you have on that SD card to a folder on, say, your desktop, for example, and copy that file, put it on there, follow the instructions, and it takes like 20 seconds to flash the thing out. It's really not a big deal, and I'm not entirely sure what the update was for, but I'm sure it fixed some kind of glitch or bug with the unit. So the manual you all can find easily on your own. Definitely familiarize yourself with this, but I would say more importantly, let's jump into the actual settings. Now, first I'm going to explain how it is that I'm using mine. Trigger input number 1, I'm using kick drum triggers. So I've got 2 bass drums, therefore I have 2 triggers, and I'm utilizing that split. Now, when you look at setting sensitivity and all these other things, they are applied globally to each port, or I'm sorry, to each trigger input. So if you have sensitivity set one way and you're using that splitter, this guy here, you have to keep in mind that all your sensitivity and threshold values and all of the different parameters are going to be applied to everything to do with trigger input 1 or trigger input 2. You may want to take screenshots of this, whatever. Let's get my pretty little mug out of the way here. Well, I'm not going to mess around with that. Apparently, clicking on things that I should not. So I'm going to leave myself... Oh, there we go. And get me out of the way slightly. So, input number 1. Start off at the root menu and hold down Shift and press Instrument. Trigger 1 setup. The way I have mine set up, the black lead on this splitter here is for the center. Let's say if you had a dual zone pad, the black one would be the center, whereas the red one would be the rim. That's irrelevant here because we've got a single zone trigger. It's basically a D drum trigger mounted. I've got 2 of which mounted to each bass drum. And the options for selecting an input, you've got all these different model numbers for Roland electronic pads and all of that. Pad X2 is generic pad. There's nothing really specific. It's just a general setting there. Pad X1 and Pad X2, the instructions say to utilize Pad X2 for this splitter type application. The type, and as you can see here, it says 1H. So that's input 1, head. Select pad model. These are the different options here that I put in brackets. Select pad model. Pad 1 and Pad 2 are for generic pads. So my current settings are here on the indentation portion here with these bulleted points. So Pad 2 is what you'd want to utilize for that. Definitely put pillows or a blanket or something in your bass drum or bass drums to dampen the head, because in a live setting you've got a bass rig right next to you and it's going to cause your head to vibrate and you're going to get all kinds of false triggering. You may think you've got everything dialed in at rehearsal, but once you're in a live setting and the volume is much higher, you're going to have some serious problems, and I learned that the hard way at one gig when I first set this up. So my sensitivity setting is about 17 or so. As you increase that value, it will increase the sensitivity. Now, keep in mind, the genre I've played primarily is metal, so there's a lot of fast double bass heel toe technique, which has got a lesser I don't want to say amplitude, but the faster you play, the less energy there is behind it, because things are moving so quick. Sure, you could play slowly and play full volume, but when you're playing something like heel toe technique, you're not going to get the same velocity out of those strikes. Therefore, the triggers may not pick up hits accurately, or you may have missed hits due to that sensitivity and the lesser velocity of the heel toe playing technique. So I found 17 was pretty much a happy number. You're probably going to want to take all these values here and tweak them slightly to suit your taste. Threshold, moving right along, the higher the value, the more it's going to mitigate any false hits. So you're dancing a fine line between not becoming too insensitive to strikes, but not too low to the point where you're going to get some false triggering. The curve has everything to do with dynamics in terms of, are you linear? Do you have more of a cosine type bell curve going on? And for what it is that I'm doing, I just want full on volume. Dynamics really aren't much of a concern there. So the manual clarifies all of these things. I'm just sharing the parameters that I found that are effective for me and what it is that I do. So let's see, loud 2. As you can see, I added a little note here, global for trigger input number. As I explained before, any devices, whether it be dual zone, single input to trigger input number 1 or 2, these settings that I'm going over right now are applicable to anything and everything going to that one port. Retrigger cancel. This is going to, as I stated here, increase the sensitivity for retriggering. So if you have a light hit or it picks up a false hit, It helps to minimize false triggering. Rim gain, this only applies if you are using a dual zone trigger. So you have a stereo cable tip ring sleeve going into a trigger input, and you are using the head and the edge to produce different samples. The rim gain affects the rim solely, and it's got a range of adjustment from 0 to 8. When I set up my pad here, I have a dual zone. It's a PD-8 right here. I don't know if you can really see that. So you've got the center head as well as the edge. So when I configured to that setting, instead of using pad 2 like I did for my triggers, I'll get into that in a little bit, but it had a default value of 1.3. So I'm going to leave it there. And if I find that the sensitivity is, lesser than that of the head, then I'll increase that value. Moving along, HR adjust and noise cancel. Those cannot be toggled or modified in any way with pad 2. Again, that applies to generic pads, whether it be a pad 1 setting or a pad 2 setting. Crosstalk cancel is pretty important when you've got multiple pads mounted to the same surface, whereas if you strike one, that vibration carries through and falsely triggers the other. This will be able to distinguish if you strike one and vibration is felt in the other. It will cancel out the other one from producing that sample at the same time. So there's pros and cons to that, obviously, and it's a balancing act. It's got a range of 0 to, I want to say 80%. Alright, moving along, I've got input 2. So keeping in mind, input 1 has got a splitter, which goes to each bass drum. So I've got 2 bass drums, XLR to 1/4 inch going to this splitter. My input 2 is for a dual zone pad. So I can hit the head or I can hit the rim and program 2 different samples to trigger when either or are struck. So the descriptors here that are listed are how they are labeled within the menus in the TM2. Let's see, trigger setup. So I duplicated everything here. So from this portion all the way down to here are identical settings internally. You can press the trigger in button 1 or 2, which will trigger the head. Let's see, am I pointing at the right thing? Yeah. Sorry, things are backwards on my end. Now, you can hold down Shift and press 1 or 2, and that's the same as striking the rim of a dual zone pad. So, as you are going to assign a sample to trigger input 1 head or rim, you can hold down Shift and press 1 in order to put it into trigger 1 rim mode, if you will, and then be able to cycle through and maybe go onto your SD card and pull maybe a sample that you've saved yourself. I'm going to get into those specifics later on after we get through these parameter settings. So everything that's highlighted here that you see, these are basically identical. I think I have an error here that's at 80, this is at 50, when really it's just a typo on my part. So not perfect over here, not claiming to be. Alright, so input number 2. This is where things switch up. So like I said, I'm using that dual zone, what is it again? It's a PD-8 dual zone pad, and these are the parameters for that. So as you hold down Shift and press instrument, that takes you into your pad setup menu, and you go through and press number 2 on trigger in on the face of the unit, or you can strike the head of the pad. And as you go through, your input has to be toggled to head and rim, and I put dual trigger there just as a personal note. I'm saving this in case I have like a catastrophic loss of my data, and I can always reference this. Under type, I have the PD8, therefore I selected the PD8. You're going to have to determine which pad that you are using and select the correct pad accordingly. Sensitivity, I have about 8. I'm probably going to tweak that, slightly, but something like this, sensitivity isn't as big of a deal as something like, bass drum triggers would be. You can probably keep my sensitivity down to prevent false triggering, and I'm going to give it a pretty good whack with my stick in order to trigger maybe a low sub-bass hit or a low sweep or some type of a sample that I've created. Threshold, that's already been explained, value of 14. Curve is linear, so basically its response is relative to the intensity in which I strike the pad. I'll probably end up changing that. If we look at curve above, we've got loud 2 for the bass drum. Right, curve and curve, loud 2. So looking in the manual, that will clarify on that for you. Retrigger cancel, value of about 10. The rim gain, like I said, 1.3 is about the default. So when you select PD8 from the options, it seemed to have automatically plugged in a value of 1.3. HR adjust and noise cancel, those were just empty. I'm not even certain if those can be toggled. I've never really had to do that. And crosstalk cancel, I really don't have anything else mounted to my stand that this is on, so there's not going to be any crosstalk. I could probably even just make that 0, but because it doesn't really matter, I'm just going to leave that at 50%. Okay, so the sample I picked for my kicks is number 114, heavy metal, and I just labeled this so that way I know that the black side of my splitter. I'm going back to trigger input 1, by the way. I kind of feel like I got off base here. So up above, we've got our trigger parameters for input 1 with the split. That's why we've got this up top here and this over here. I'm going to try to be like a weatherman here. Maybe I can point. Yeah, I'll go like this over here somewhere. So input 2, same thing applies. So that's all the sensitivity and threshold values and things that cause the pad to respond in a way that is desirable. Now I'm moving on to the settings, the samples that were selected. So when I strike a pad, it's going to produce the sound that I desire. When I play the bass drums, it's going to give me that bass drum sound as opposed to using a microphone in my kicks instead. So when you go into settings, you look through your manual, you strike the pad and you can press the directional arrows left or right to cycle through what samples you want to play. So I started out here with sample number 114. You can hold down shift and press the right or left arrow, and it will skip ahead based on groupings. Let's say you've got snare drums, bass drums, toms, and specialty samples in different categories. So volume level is set at 100%. Obviously I want maximum amplitude coming out of the unit without keeping my volume knob cranked up completely and having maybe a distorted sound output. Dynamics, this has everything to do with how it responds in terms of producing a sound when it's hit. If it's a light hit, are you going to have a low volume output of that sound? And if you nail the thing really hard, is it going to give you a full volume? So I have mine set, because the genre again is metal, so everything is just full on loud, and I have that set to max. Again, refer to the manual for all the different variations and what it is that you can choose. You may be playing a different style you could be doing, jazz, where dynamics is very, very important. Ghost notes and stuff like that, you want those things to be picked up. The pitch you can tweak up or down. If you've got a sample, you like how it sounds, but it's just too high or too low, and you want to do some onboard adjustments, you can tweak your pitch. Panning. Here's something that really matters when it comes to interfacing with a mixer, and you want to be able to isolate channels. By default, everything is center balance. So regardless if you are playing the bass drum or you're hitting a pad to trigger a sample, your outputs on the unit, you've got left mono and right. If that's going to a mixer, there's no way to separate your kick drums from whatever your samples are. So in order to do that, you need to pan your bass drums full on left or right, whichever you prefer. And then for your samples, for trigger input 2, do the polar opposite of that. So I have my kick drums panned full left and my samples panned full right. So each 1/4 inch output from the unit itself, I've got 2 outputs going to a mixer. Therefore you have independent volume control, ultimate control over the volume of your kick drums as well as your samples. Let's say trigger input number 2, you've got the dual zone like I'm setting up, and let's say the head sample is a consistent good volume that I like, and I strike the rim and it's very quiet. Well, what's going to end up needing to happen is you have to make an onboard adjustment to the unit itself and adjust your volume level here in order to compensate for that, to try to get a better balance. Or when you are working in your DAW and you have an audio sample, you can adjust the amplitude of your sample and save it again, either by beefing it up or lowering the amplitude as needed. Loop. So if loop is toggled on and you hit the head, it's going to repeat that sample over and over until you restrike the head again, it's basically an on-off switch, essentially, is what's going on there. Mono/poly. So the mono cancels the existing sound if a sample is overlapped. So if you strike the pad concurrently within, say, half a second of each other, and the first time you struck the pad, the sample is playing, and it hasn't subsided, there hasn't been decay of that initial sample being played, and you strike the head again, it's going to stop the first one and then kick in the second one. Most people just want an overlap, so leave it on poly. I can't really think of many scenarios where you'd want it to be mono. I don't know why I got Molly here. It's mono/poly. Offset. So if you're striking the pad and it's taking a few milliseconds for it to produce the sound that you want, let's say you've got a little blip of dead space at the front of your sample, you can jog the origin of where that sample begins to play and use this to offset latency or offset of the actual attack portion of that waveform before it falls off. Mute group. Read in on the manual for this. This doesn't really apply to me in my application, but this really gives you the ability to cluster a couple of pads. So cancellation or whatever. Remember we talked about up here crosstalk cancel. I believe it has to do with that. But again, it doesn't really apply to my application here, so things are kind of on a need-to-know basis. I'm not going to study up on things that aren't relative to what it is I'm trying to do here. If you are using the MIDI ports, let's say you're working with Superior Drummer 2.0 or whatever the latest and greatest VST type drum pack is out there, then you can toggle your MIDI channel number to correspond with where you want it to fall within your interface. Effect send I have set to off because I want it to be set where it's just raw signal. I'm not getting any compression or reverb or anything like that. That can all be done post effects through a mixer or in my DAW. And for type, through basically means you have no effects at all. You're bypassing any onboard effects. And there's a whole laundry list of different effects that you can use, including reverb, which may be something you want to do in a live setting, where you can just have just a little splash of reverb in there to try to make things sound less dry. Okay, so that is for the splitter, channel 1, for one of the bass drums. I've duplicated all of those settings. I'm not going to review those. We've got a duplicate. Just copy everything that you got going on. I gave explanations up here as to, what these are for and how they affect the overall performance of the unit and the samples that are being produced. So I'm going to skip over 2, which is red/ring, which is looking at here. Again, you've got head, rim, which is ring, so tip, ring, sleeve, head, rim, and then this is just the ground, electrical ground. Trigger number 2, head in the center. I have a sub-bass sample that I created, and I'm going to skip ahead up here a little bit. When you create a sample right here, the format has to be in a wave format, so it's lossless. Sample rate has to be 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit sample bit rate. And it can be mono or stereo. Because this is going to produce sounds based on how you have them panned, there's really no harm or foul in just producing a mono sample. Although you may choose to just do a stereo output when you do a final export of your sample. When you store your samples on your SD card, once you format it on the unit, it's going to create folders and subfolders. And the folder at the root of your SD card is Roland, and then the next folder is Wave. So any samples you create need to be saved in this directory. And as you can see, I've noted here that subfolders are okay to create for your own personal organization and structure. So that part is done. So I have my own sample. Here's a file name of it. And the volume level is 80. Dynamics is max. Pitch is 0. And unlike my bass drums, go up here. Where are you? So instrument trigger 1. Left 15, that's full left. And then trigger 2, which is my dual zone pad, is hard right. The rim edge is also hard right. Loop is off. That really shouldn't be on for anything if you're using it to create a acoustic electric hybrid type kit. Poly, we've gone over all of these different parameters. The note number, this is MIDI. Really, I have no purpose for that as of yet, although it may be useful in the future. And through, so we're bypassing all effects and all of that. So volume levels are high, 80 percentile or greater. Samples are all pan hard right, like I stated. Poly, the note number is irrelevant, and we're bypassing effects. So once you've got all that set, you're going to want to go through, follow the manual in terms of creating a name. Kit number 1, you can press the plus or minus buttons and be able to cycle through from the root menu and select whatever preset kits that they have on there. You're creating your own custom kit, and most likely you're going to want to back up those settings. So In order to back that up, you want to hold down Shift and press Instrument, and then right arrow until you get to Backup Save, and press plus to enter that utility. Press the Trigger N2 button in order to enter the prompt to create or modify that save name for your backup. Press the Instrument button again once you've gone through, and you use the plus or minus and left and right arrows to be able to move the cursor and select the alphanumeric characters that you want, and then plus or minus to choose a save slot, and then right arrow to advance to the confirmation to save, and then press the positive or plus button in order to save your backup. So that's all I got for you. It's quite a bit, and hopefully I kept things pretty straightforward and not too confusing for you. I'm not really looking for much out of this, just trying to help out the general community here with getting their modules set up. I know it was a bit of a struggle and learning curve for me getting started. So with that being said, I'm going to sign off, and good luck in your endeavor, and I hope you're able to find everything that you need to get yourself tuned in and ready to roll. Alright guys, Mark Pelkey, peace out.